Okay, great. Hi, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I am Dr. Jessica Parker. I am the founder and owner of the Academic Writing Center, and I'm excited to talk to you today about developing academic arguments. This is an hour-long webinar, and during the webinar, just some kind of housekeeping rules. If you could just do me a favor and keep your mic muted and use the chat to communicate with us. My colleague, Dr. Veronica Richard, who's a member of my team, is manning the chat today, and she will be answering your questions. She'll also interrupt me and kind of jump in if she thinks it's a good opportunity to bring up your questions in the moment. Otherwise, we'll go through the presentation and address your questions at the end. But if you've attended one of our webinars before, I try to make it interactive. And so I really do try to take a moment and pause to address questions that Veronica brings up. So please use the chat, enter your questions, and we'll get to as many of them as possible. So a little bit about me, for those of you who don't know me. Like I said, I'm the founder and CEO of the Academic Writing Center and also Dissertation by Design. Before starting my first business, Dissertation by Design, I was a research director, a healthcare research director in Boston. I'm a reviewer for several prominent healthcare research journals, and I've authored 11 peer-reviewed publications and successfully secured several research grants. So I know a thing or two about academic writing and developing arguments. And in fact, this topic itself, developing academic arguments, is something we're covering this month in the Academic Writing Center. A little bit about our two businesses. Dissertation by Design is the business that I founded 5 years ago. We work with PhD students, really grad students, and early career faculty to help to guide them through the process of designing their research and conceptualizing their research, as well as analyzing data, and we have professional editing services. Whereas the Academic Writing Center is really a community of practice for any sort of academic writer, regardless of your discipline or your level of research experience. We write in community and we learn about different aspects of academic writing every week. And then we also have writing coaches who specialize in working with writers who speak English as their second language. Okay, let's dive in. Today's agenda, we have a lot to talk about. Academic arguments across disciplines. This is something I'm briefly going to address. Then I'm going to talk about the different components, kind of these foundational components of an academic argument that are present regardless of the discipline. And then we'll talk about simple and complex claims, counter arguments, and then I'll present 3 different argumentative writing methods. But before I dive in, I just want to make it really clear that there are more than 3 argumentative writing methods. There are many that you can choose from. And the way you structure your argument also differs based on the discipline or the writing genre that you're in. And so I'm not going to go into that level of detail today. I want you to think about this as more of a high-level overview of the components of an academic argument, regardless of your discipline and maybe how you end up structuring the argument. But I will give you different examples today. And I do have resources that I'll share. I will send out for everyone who registered a recording of this webinar, as well as all of the resources that I share in today's presentation. So don't panic if you don't have a resource in your email. I'll send it out to you. You haven't missed anything. Let's touch on some key terminology. I'm going to be using these terms frequently throughout today's webinar, so I think it's important to know the differences in these terms and what they mean. So an academic argument, just generally speaking, is just an expression of a point of view on a subject and then supporting it with evidence. Depending on your discipline, there are different types of evidence that can qualify as evidence, but that's not really the point today. We're just going to talk about evidence generally. Evidence is just data that supports or substantiates an argument or a claim. We'll also talk about counter arguments today. This is your way of addressing an objection to your argument or presenting other viewpoints. We'll talk about a thesis statement, which is just the main idea of an academic paper. and then a claim, which is a declarative sentence proposing a truth that is open to debate. Now, some of these terms are used interchangeably within different articles or textbooks. Like, for example, if you were to Google, how to develop an academic argument, some teachers might use the term main idea as thesis statement or main claim as thesis statement. So I'm really going to try to differentiate these terms today instead of using them synonymously. I want to get started with a poll. I'm just curious. I want to get kind of my finger on the pulse of everyone's confidence in developing arguments. How confident are you in your ability to develop a strong academic argument? I'm going to launch this poll. Are you highly confident, confident, fairly confident, or maybe you're not confident at all? Give a moment for everyone to respond. A lot of people in the fairly confident category, 60%. Waiting for a few more people to answer. Okay, I'm going to end the poll. So 60% of you are fairly confident. 6% are highly confident. 12% of you are confident, and 23% are not confident. So again, depending on your discipline, the way you build an argument is different. But hopefully by the end of the day today, all of you will feel at least somewhat confident in understanding the components of an academic argument and how to structure an argument, just generally speaking, using some examples that I'll share, specifically 3 different argumentative methods. Grab some more. Okay, so argumentation across disciplines. I just want to point this out because if you're in the sciences or maybe English literature or a history major or a law student, these are different disciplines, and the way the arguments are structured are going to be different. But regardless, there are some commonalities, and those are the commonalities we're really going to touch on today. So regardless of your discipline, an academic argument requires logical reasoning. You're going to use claims, you're going to use evidence, you're going to analyze that evidence, and counter arguments are almost always present within an academic argument. The differences based on your discipline is the goal of the argument. Also, the sources and types of evidence will differ. The evidence I use in a healthcare research article is definitely going to be different than the types of evidence or the sources of evidence I'm going to use if I'm an English lit major. And then the way you construct the argument will also differ based on your discipline. And so I will share a wonderful resource with you when I share the webinar recording. It's an article that touches on argumentation across the disciplines, specifically history, English literature, and the sciences, and it uses a lot of examples. I think it's really useful. So I'll definitely share that with you. Okay, let's dive into the components of an academic argument. Thesis statement, at least one claim, usually multiple claims, evidence, and then a counter argument, or there might be several objections that you're identifying with your counter argument. And then inherent to all of this is logical reasoning. That's really what connects the dots here. And I find that when I'm working with especially novice scholars, even though they may understand the components of an academic argument, they're not explicit enough so that logical reasoning doesn't come through for the reader. And a lot of times that happens because A, you're really close to the topic, and so you're making some assumptions that the reader will be able to connect the dots. And so when you do that, by not being explicit, that logical reasoning doesn't come through when you're writing. So we don't have time to get into that today about how to make sure that the actual writing itself reflects the appropriate writing for an academic argument. But that is definitely something to keep in mind, because it's not just about cognitively being aware of these components. It's also being explicit in the writing and using appropriate rhetorical devices to kind of link these components together. So let's start with the thesis statement. This is the first component. So a thesis statement is typically located in the introduction to a paper or even a journal article. The exception to this, which I'll touch on at the very end of the presentation and an example, is in scientific publications. Sometimes this thesis statement is at the very end of the article in the discussion after the evidence has been put forth. But generally speaking, the thesis is an introduction. The thesis statement is the main idea of the paper. It must be supported by evidence. And then the thesis statement also guides the reader by being really explicit about what the argument is and how it's going to be supported. And this thesis statement will evolve through the reading and writing process. This is not a linear process of writing. If you've attended any of my webinars in the past, you know I talk a lot about the writing process being very cyclical and iterative. And so your original thesis statement will likely evolve as you begin to compile evidence and develop your claims. So just keep that in the back of your mind. But this is an example of a thesis statement here, and this is kind of going to guide us through several examples in today's presentation. So in this paper, I will argue that although it is challenging to isolate the contributing factors of nurse burnout, this occupational phenomenon can be prevented if interventions are developed within the context of stressors in the work environment and individual level characteristics. And so this becomes more of an obvious thesis statement because I use the term argue, but sometimes that word isn't there and it's still a thesis statement. But I just wanted to be really explicit here in what a thesis statement can look like. So let's quickly just differentiate between topic and thesis. So I was actually talking with a client earlier this week, and this happens frequently where I'll meet with someone who's just starting to conceptualize their research ideas. And they start with a topic, really an interest that evolves into what ultimately becomes, a research question or a thesis statement. But it's important to recognize that a topic is different than a thesis statement. So the topic is just the subject of your paper. So going back to that thesis statement I just listed, it could be, outcomes associated with nurse burnout interventions in healthcare organizations. As you can tell, that's different than the thesis statement, which is the argument of the paper. And so these are very different things that I think it's important to know the difference between how you communicate your research topic versus your thesis statement. Then we have a claim, or in many academic arguments, there are multiple claims. But a claim can often appear as a topic sentence. Not always, it doesn't have to be a topic sentence, but a lot of times it is, especially if you're writing a lit review or a longer academic paper that includes like an in-depth summary or overview of the literature. You might have a different claim for every paragraph, and so it can show up as a topic sentence. It's obviously need to be logically connected to the thesis statement. That's where the writing really comes in handy, where you need to understand how to explicitly connect the dots for the reader so that logic is obvious. Claims must be supported by evidence. And then in order to develop claims, you have to have knowledge of the research and have the ability to draw conclusions and draw inferences from the research in order to show that you not only understand the evidence, but you can link it to your research agenda or your thesis statement. And so inherent to this process is you have to be familiar with the literature. And the conversation I was having with a client this week is she's just getting started. So she has to start somewhere. So her thesis statement right now is very likely going to change because she isn't an expert yet. She hasn't read all of the relevant literature on her topic. And so when I start with a client, when we're starting to develop an argument, we just start with what you know. Sometimes it's based on assumptions that you have or hunches that you have based on your own personal experience, or maybe based on a couple of articles you've read on your topic. But ultimately, the final paper or publication that you submit, the claims are finalized after you're completely knowledgeable of the topic. And so then to further break it down, is a claim can be simple or complex. And an academic paper can and should have both simple and complex claims. There's no kind of rule of thumb that says, you know, you need more complex claims than simple claims. It's not that formulaic. But what I think is helpful, especially when I show you some examples, is when you're writing, if you have been told or you notice that your paragraphs are too long, like a paragraph spans an entire page, then that typically means maybe you have too many claims within that paragraph that you're trying to support with evidence. And maybe it's a complex claim that can be broken up into simpler claims, so you can break up those paragraphs. So let's look at an example of these two. So kind of going along with this thesis statement about arguing about the need to isolate contributing factors of nurse burnout before you can develop interventions. A simple claim would be nurse burnout increased during the COVID-19 pandemic. That's simple. A complex claim on the same topic would be nurse burnout is caused by a myriad of factors, of which staff shortages and emotional strain are the two most commonly reported factors that lead to nurse burnout. And so the difference here, hopefully you can see, is that this complex claim requires logic and argumentation to demonstrate what the claim is. Whereas a simple claim can often be supported with even a single piece of evidence. So I'm going to show you what the evidence can look like to kind of try to pull this together for you. So again, as a reminder, evidence is just data. It's used to support claims and the overall thesis of the paper. In this example that I'm using, which is a healthcare research example, it's a scientific article. The peer-reviewed articles are really important, so we're looking at empirical evidence. This simple claim could be supported with this evidence. The results of a recent meta-analysis by Prattner et al. Indicated that nurse burnout increased from 35 to 79% pre to post-pandemic. But with a complex claim, you would need multiple pieces of evidence to argue that the two most commonly reported factors that led to an increase in burnout were staff shortages and emotional strain. Does everyone see the difference there? I'm just going to look over at the chat. Veronica, do you think I need to pause to address any of these?
I was looking at Sophia's comment here. You might want to address that when I was just getting ready to respond to it. So can an academic argument of this kind be written to help you defend your dissertation, or as a way to consolidate key data and information to argue the research?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I also want to make sure I'm understanding your question, Sophia. So written to help you defend your dissertation, like to justify why you're researching your topic, absolutely. Or if you're talking about defending your dissertation, like in your final defense within the discussion and conclusion sections of your dissertation, then yes, it's also applicable in that scenario. The length of the argument, like how many claims you have, just depends on what you're writing. Like in some examples I'll show you today, you'll see that one argument could be supported with 15 different simple claims. Or if it's a scholarly publication, there might only be one complex claim and the evidence is presented in 3 paragraphs. So it really depends on what you're writing and who your audience is, and your discipline also has kind of different parameters. But yes, you can use it to defend your dissertation.
Yeah, and let me just, I had, let's see, it's Stephanie had commented, is there a specific time to use a complex versus a simple claim? And I was thinking, Jessica, that actually a thesis statement could be considered a complex claim because there are many parts to it, right?
Yeah.
And so as we are, it depends on what section we're in, right? But those complex claims tend to be the larger focus of a section if we're talking about in a dissertation, to whereas the simple claims are then used as support that complex claim exists.
Yeah, because with an argument, you have to unpack it. So on the surface, because obviously this simple claim, nurse burnout increased during the COVID pandemic, is taken out of context. We're just looking at it on a PowerPoint slide. So on the surface, you might think, how is that relevant to the thesis statement? The thesis statement has nothing to do with COVID, but it actually does, because part of the argument is that interventions have to be developed within the context of stressors in the work environment. So under this simple claim, if we had a full paragraph here, the author could argue that the stressors associated with COVID are not the same stressors that are pre or post COVID. So therefore, interventions developed for stressors that came up in the work environment during COVID might not be applicable, 5 years from now. And so that's what I can't pack all that sort of information into a PowerPoint slide, but there are many different ways you could unpack this thesis statement. And that could be one of them, where maybe you have a lot of different simple claims to show how stressors in the work environment differ based on the type of setting, the type of population served, the regional, the sociodemographic status of the people living within a certain setting. Like, there's a lot of ways you can unpack that, and it really depends on the author's perspective and how they're structuring their research agenda. And then same within this thesis, like the first part of the argument, that it's challenging to isolate the contributing factors of nurse burnout. So that right there could be unpacked into all the different contributing factors and showing how maybe there's conflicting evidence on how to control for different moderating or mediating variables. Just, it really depends on the overall research agenda and the study that the author is conducting. And then also inherent within this, if you're writing a dissertation, you have 40 pages maybe to unpack this. Whereas if you're writing a scholarly publication, you might have 1 page or 4 paragraphs to unpack this. So the number of claims and the amount of evidence you have to support those claims is going to look different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, they are thankful for that information.
Okay. Let's see. I think I went over that one already. So this is just an example of how I go about drafting claims and evidence. So again, going back to that thesis statement, maybe, I'm writing a lit review and I have, 17 different claims. And this is just one of them. And maybe I have 3 pieces of evidence that I'm going to use to support that claim. So this is how, when I start drafting, I write my claim, which is typically the topic sentence of a paragraph, and then I organize my evidence underneath it in bulleted lists before I start writing in narrative form. And so this is one way. This is just kind of a tip. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this in terms of just organizing your claims and evidence when you're preparing to fully develop your argument. Okay, so I just want to do a little test here. Let's do a quick poll. Second. Poll 2, launch. Hopefully this will be obvious to you, but which of these is considered argumentative, like for a thesis statement? Yeah. Ooh, all over the place. Give it a little more time. Only 40% of you have responded. Yeah, a majority of you are here. I'll go ahead and end the poll. Are picking up on the fact that, I'll share the results, that the second one is argumentative. So a paper persuading readers is different than a paper describing. It doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It's just the purpose of the paper is different. So the first option, a paper describing, would be maybe it's a more descriptive study, or maybe it's a lit review that describes the prevalence and the contributing factors and the interventions. And that's what you're developing before you're able to really understand the evidence enough to build an argument. But arguments are typically about persuasion, not always. As you'll see in the different types of methods we'll talk about, But yeah, option B is definitely the argumentative thesis statement. Going to move on. So counter argument. So I'll first just a disclaimer, counter arguments are not always present in academic arguments, particularly in scholarly publications in the sciences, and not in the sciences, like different disciplines in the sciences. So for instance, in like a healthcare research, because I'm familiar with healthcare research, if I'm writing an article and there's a short word count, I may not present both sides of the argument. I'll present one side of the argument within the lit review because I don't have the word count, but I'm also being very conscious of my language, the bias I'm using, and it just depends on your discipline. And so I just really want to put that out there. But even if you're not including the counter argument in the writing itself, building an academic argument requires a knowledge and understanding of the different opposing views on the topic. It also enhances your credibility as a researcher, showing that you've considered and you understand the points of view of other researchers in your field. And so if you haven't developed a counter argument before, these are some kind of guiding questions to get you there. Think about opposing arguments in the literature. Like think about the lit review. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. See what other authors have said about different opposing views. And then think about your position on the counter argument. You need to take a stance. That's part of this process of building an argument, is kind of getting over the imposter syndrome and finding your voice and taking a stance on a topic. It's also important to be fair, respectful, and objective, and be consistent with your original position. And so depending on your discipline, the way counter arguments kind of show up in the writing are going to differ. Like if you're in law, there's typically an emotional component. You're trying to persuade the reader. That emotional component is not really acceptable in the hard sciences. And so this is just kind of a high level overview of your considerations for developing a counter argument. And we're going to look at an example here.
Hey, Jessica,
Yeah.
would you talk about the difference between describe and argue?
Yeah. So with describing, my goal isn't to persuade you, it's just to inform you. Like it's one thing for me to sit here and just tell you, a lot of burnout increased during the pandemic. It's this really prevalent kind of issue that we're noticing in nurses. There's a lot of contributing factors, and these are some interventions. I can say that in a very objective way where I'm not trying to persuade you to adopt a certain intervention within your organization. So I think of describing as just like, I'm just giving you information and you can make your own conclusion and decision based on this information I'm providing. But if I'm crafting an argument, I am taking a position on some aspect of the information that I'm sharing, and I'm trying to persuade you not to necessarily pick a side, because as you'll see in the methods, the different argumentative methods, sometimes you're taking a middle ground and the argument is about helping the reader understand that both sides of the argument are viable, but you're still taking a position. It's not just to inform. There's an aspect of persuasion in there.
Yeah, and Jessica, I think that's an important distinction, because a lot of people, if we're talking just purely persuasion, we do not show the other side. So the difference between a pure persuasive document and an argument is that the argument shows the counter sides and shows those alternative perspectives.
Yes, and within the context of, yes, an academic argument, you should, because as researchers, this is a big part of addressing our bias. Like we're not going into the literature to only look for answers that support our perspective. We have to look at both sides and make decisions that are informed by all the evidence available. And so, yes, when you're building an academic argument is different than, building an argument. I always use this example of like you're in a courtroom and you're persuading a jury. That is very different than this type of persuasion in an academic argument. Yeah. And so again, if you're writing a peer-reviewed publication, even if you don't have the word count to present a full counter argument on the back end as an academic, as a scholar, there is an expectation that you understand the opposing views. And typically, if you're writing a longer academic paper, like a thesis or a dissertation, you do go ahead and present the different counter arguments. And so here's just a quick example of one. Similar to what I showed you earlier, where I had the claim and the evidence listed. A counter argument to part of the thesis I presented earlier is that nurse burnout is highly contextual. Thus, the factors that impact burnout must be considered in light of organizational level and individual level moderating variables to obtain valid results. Just to kind of stepping back, let's just say, I want to give you an example of how this could evolve. So let's say when I started, if this is my topic, when I started my study, I came from an organization as a nurse where we did these mindfulness-based practices. And so I started with an interest in understanding, mindfulness-based practices or interventions to prevent burnout. But then after reading the literature, I realized there are a lot of different interventions and a lot of different factors that cause burnout. And so then my thesis kind of shifts. And then I also realized that there's this other argument, this opposing view that you can't just say one intervention is going to meet the needs of all nurses. It's highly contextual. You have to consider different characteristics of the organization and such like individual coping strategies. And so then you present that counter argument, and then you still take a position. You still kind of go back to your original thesis, but you have to present evidence to support the counter argument, just like you do your thesis statement. So there are some writing templates for counter arguments. I don't have them all here, but I love this website. This is the Academic Phrase Bank. I'm just going to click on it so you can see, for those of you not familiar. The University of Manchester developed this. They have a PDF version of it, but basically there's all these language functions you can click on. And so let's say, what were we just talking about? Counter arguments. Let's just say you're, comparing and contrasting. You can click on that, and let's say you're introducing differences. It gives you all these templates, similarities, explaining causality. There's a lot here that I think is incredibly useful. So a lot of times if I'm stuck with the wording, it's like I know what I want to say, but I'm not sure how I want to lay out the sentence and wordsmith it. I'll go to the Academic Phrase Bank and I'll look at these different writing templates. And so these are different templates that you can use for developing a counter argument.
Hey, Jessica.
Yeah.
Can you explain the difference between an opinion and an argument or a claim, if you will, that is supported by research?
Yeah, so, well, an opinion would not, the inherent difference in a claim that you're supporting with evidence is an opinion is typically anecdotal. It's not based on the evidence. Sometimes you start with an opinion, you have an opinion about the topic, and then you go into the evidence and maybe that opinion changes because you have to start somewhere. You're not just instantly going to be familiar with all of the evidence on a topic. But when you're in academic writing, everything has to be supported by evidence. So it would be opinion if I just said, all nurses are very frustrated, especially during the pandemic, they're all exhausted, and most of them just want to quit their jobs. That is an opinion. I would not be able to show evidence that all nurses feel that way. I could pull a ton of articles that maybe say 35% feel burnout, maybe 70% of nurses are quitting at one hospital, but I wouldn't be able to find evidence to support that opinion. I would have to shift that opinion, maybe if I start thinking that, to an actual claim that reflects the evidence so that I can support it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so I first want to say before we dive in here that there are many different argumentative writing methods. These are just 3 methods that you can use. And I will say that in the examples that I'm going to use in this section, they're from undergraduate papers, but that's okay. They still wonderfully lay out these different argumentative writing methods. So I think they're good examples. But you'll notice, because I'm going to share the PDFs with you with the recording, that they're not written at like the doctoral level. There's definitely a little bit of biased language in there. So just keep in mind that these were undergraduate papers, but the argumentative writing methods that they use are very clear within the paper. So I think it's helpful because, as I have starred here, organization is very, very important when thinking about how to craft your argument. So I'm going to do a quick poll. I'm just curious to hear from you on whether or not you use a specific organizational strategy when you build an argument. Maybe you always do, maybe you sometimes do, maybe you're not aware that there were options when organizing your argument. Sometimes, yeah. Yeah, most of you, a majority of everyone here, will share the results. We're not aware of different methods for organizing the argument. So I'm excited. Hopefully you'll, some of these will resonate with you today, or if these specific argumentative writing methods don't resonate with you, at least you'll come out of this knowing that there are options and you can go online and search for different argumentative writing methods within your specific discipline. Let's first talk about the Rogerian method. This method is really most appropriate when you're looking at controversial issues. And the underlying assumption, if you choose to use this method, is that the audience will perceive your argument as a reasonable compromise if you present the argument objectively and highlight the common ground between distinct perspectives. And so an academic paper written using this argumentative method starts with an introduction, then presents an opposing view, then there's a statement of understanding, a statement of your position, a statement of context, and a statement of benefits. And typically there are examples included within this. And so I'm going to show you a paper with the Rogerian method, and I'll send this with the PowerPoint. Oh, I can say files in the trash. That's weird. So this is a paper about the debate about homeschooling. And there are comments in here that are helpful. So this came from the Purdue OWL website. They do a great job of taking papers and then really dissecting them according to these different argumentative methods. And so in this case, they've already done the work for me. They point out the thesis statement, they point out the middle ground. And so I'm going to share these with you after the presentation. And I think it would be helpful for you to read through this and look at these comments to see how these different components have been flagged. And as I discussed earlier, the types of evidence, the sources of evidence included within these methods differ based on the discipline. So some of the sources within this paper are not the types of high quality sources I would maybe use in healthcare research, but they are appropriate for this discipline. So try not to evaluate it in that sense, really just thinking about the organizational structure. And so in this,
Jessica, if you're gonna talk through the document, can you just make it a little bit bigger?
like that.
Perfect, thank you.
Good. I'm also looking at the time. I don't know if I have time to go through it. We only have 15 minutes. I'll just highlight, because this Rogerian method, again, is about controversial issues. So the controversy is, in this paper, the author presents these 2 sides about homeschooling. On one side of the debate is the argument that if students are in abusive situations at home or their parents aren't really involved in homeschooling, then homeschooling is just overall just not a good idea. And then there's the other side of the debate that if there are state policies in place to protect students and create some structure around testing, then homeschooling is a good idea. And so the author takes a middle ground and says, I do support homeschooling, but there should be options and there should be policies. And so that's what I mean by middle ground. And basically this whole introduction is showing how the author takes that middle ground. And then if you read through this, you'll see these other components of the Rogerian method. And I'm going to move on because we're running out of time. Okay, and then we have the classical method. This is also called, this is from Aristotle. And so you'll often see it online, different writers refer to it differently, but I call it the classical method. The underlying assumption here is that the course of action will be clear when all parties understand the issue. So it's all about kind of defining these different maybe claims or positions, and then defining them and applying the evidence. So the format kind of looks like this. There's an introduction, there's a background statement, you make a proposition, you provide proof, that can be the evidence, then there's a refutation, and then conclusion. And these are definitions of all these components. So in the introduction, you're talking about the issue and its significance. The background, this is where you provide some contextual information. Your claims are stated in the proposition. The proof is the evidence. The refutation is the counter argument, and then there's a conclusion. And so there's another paper here that I will share with you about the classical argument method. And this is about legalizing marijuana in the state of Texas. And again, I'm not going to go through it for the sake of time, but there are comments here that point out these different components of the argument to make it really easy for you to just understand how the structure comes together. And then the Toulmin method is the one I am most familiar with because it is commonly used across a lot of different disciplines. It's used in the sciences. It's ideal for building like this very logical chain of reasoning. And the underlying assumption is that the audience will support your argument if the key claims are logically supported with evidence. And so you have these components. You have claim, data, that's your evidence, the warrant. Let me go to the next slide because that has the definitions. The data is presenting your evidence. The warrant is you explaining why your evidence supports the claim. The backing is an additional maybe sentence or two of logic or reasoning to support the warrant. And then the counterclaim, that's the counter argument, and then your rebuttal. And so again, I have an example paper here using the Toulmin method. And again, like I said, this is an undergraduate studies paper, so the writing is not at a doctoral level, but you can still see the components of this argument if you scroll through it. So again, we don't have time to go through this, but I just want to show you the value of these in terms of looking at through these comments when you're reading them and kind of referring back to the main components of these methods. So with all that said, not to add a layer of like complexity or confusion, there are different ways to think about structuring an argument, particularly if you're writing a peer-reviewed article, if you're submitting an article for publication. So for instance, in healthcare and the sciences, we typically follow the MRAD structure: introduction, methods, results, and discussion, where there's a limit on your word count. And with the scientific method, as many of you likely know, you're starting with like a hypothesis or a thesis, which can be in the introduction to the paper. But ultimately, your overall claim, like your final claim that you're making, isn't put forth until the very end of the article in the discussion, until you've presented all of the evidence. So it doesn't follow this perfect structure of thesis statement with body paragraphs that have claims and evidence. When you think about the overall structure of a publication in the sciences, the claim comes at the end because you followed the scientific method and you've presented the evidence. And then you're like, okay, with all of this evidence that we've presented, this is the final claim. So I'm just going to show you what that looks like in the systematic review and meta-analysis. So you can just kind of follow me a little easier here. Let me make this bigger. Okay, so this is about quotation accuracy in medical journal articles. And so these authors conducted a systematic review and meta-analysis. So let me find these components that I'm basically talking about here. So this shows up as like a thesis statement. They've presented this background information, basically gaps in the literature, kind of issues in the literature. And then they tell you straight up front, as a consequence, we carried out a systematic lit review and meta-analysis of studies on quotation accuracy, ... We aimed at estimating ... So this is basically them setting up their thesis statement. It's not necessarily an argument yet, because you have to then go through the entire article to understand the argument with the evidence. So it's not going to follow any of the three methods that I talked about. I'm showing you this so that you can see that there are different ways to structure an argument outside of those methods. And it does differ based on the publication and the journal. And so for these authors, they have this kind of thesis statement in the beginning where they tell you what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. Then the ultimate claim, after they present all of their data, comes in the beginning of the discussion, where they say, this study yielded 2 main results. And then they back that up with evidence, and they compare and they contrast their evidence with those in the field. So for this paper, and for many scientific papers that follow the MRAD format, the discussion and the conclusion section are where those components of the argumentative writing show up the most, not within the small lit review section or introduction to the article. So I just wanted to make that clear, because I know some people here are probably writing a dissertation, and then some people here are writing a journal article. There are some additional resources that I'm going to share. Here's a document that I'll share with you on writing for publication, argument, and evidence that I think is really helpful. I'll share that with you, particularly if you're writing an article for publication. I think this is really helpful for kind of outlining the writing aspects, where you want to focus on your tone, your emphasis, and your verb tense. And then these kind of other aspects of the argument that we talked about today, but it gets more specific with like a research question. And then there's really great examples. And this is really great for if you're in healthcare, because it uses healthcare examples. So I will share that with you. And then argumentation across the disciplines. I mentioned this earlier. I'll also share this with you. This focuses on how argumentation differs based on whether you're in 3 specific disciplines: history, the sciences, and then English literature. So I'll also share that with you, because I think it really is important to kind of take this high level information that we're providing about the components of an argument, and then think about how that fits within your specific discipline. I think that's my last slide. Okay, let's talk for a moment about questions or comments. Is there anything that you'd like for me to return to in kind of the last few minutes of this webinar? Or Veronica, if you saw a question come through.
Yeah, there was one on the similarities and or differences between a hypothesis and a claim. My response was that sometimes it depends, that sometimes a hypothesis is bigger, it's more like a complex claim. And then other times, if I'm providing my hypothesis to my quantitative research questions, it's more of a simple claim in that perspective.
Yeah,
So,
I think it was like where it's showing up in the paper, because none of these things are mutually exclusive. You can't have one without the other. And so it's not easy to just draw these lines in the sand and say, this is how you know the difference. So, a hypothesis isn't going to show up in, the 4th paragraph of an introduction. It's typically at the very beginning of the introduction or at the very end of the introduction after you've presented the gap in the literature. And hypotheses are very common in quantitative studies, and they're based on, you typically have a theory behind why you're hypothesizing what you're hypothesizing, and then you have to unpack that with different claims. So yeah, there's no clear line in the sand, but you're not going to have, you might have 15 claims in your paper, but you're not going to have 15 hypotheses. So there are different kind of purposes of it. You would word a hypothesis, I think, differently. So I think it just, yeah, I know that that's not like a perfect answer, but claims take many forms. So it's not easy to be like, this is the exact difference. They're all very much related and interconnected.
Yeah. And then Jessica, if you'll look, I just posted something in the chat. So and so did Chang. They were wondering which argument this might be, this IELTS writing task 2. So you're presented with a point of view, argument, or problem and asked to write an essay in response. So which argument do you think that would follow?
Well, it depends on the prompt. So the Rogeri method is for controversial issues. So if it's a controversial issue, you could use that. The Toolman method I'm most familiar with. So if we go back, let me go back. So the Toolman method I'm most familiar with, and I prefer this method, but it's not always appropriate. And it's where you have a logical chain of reasoning that builds on itself to support your argument. But the Rogeri method, so if it's controversial, I think you should choose that one. And this method, the classical method, is like your stance isn't maybe as strong. It's like, okay, here's my position, but I'm going to present both sides, and then the position will be clear. It's so hard without really taking a deeper dive into these examples, which we don't have time to do. But just based on the way that question is worded, I think I would have to know the prompt and understand your position and the evidence that you have available. I don't have enough information.
Yeah, I agree. It really would depend on the prompt itself. If it said something and you disagreed, then you'd want to show both sides and go through all that. So yeah.
So Kim or someone just asked about data warrant and backing. So we just don't. That's a whole. We could have a whole section on that. I will recommend. Where's this book? So this book, the literature review 6 Steps to Success by Mackey and McAvoy. They do a really good job of explaining those different components. They use these terms when they talk about a lit review, because a lit review is essentially a complex argument. And they have lots of examples within that book to really help you see the differences between warrants and data, warrant, and backing. But in short, the warrant is it's in your own words. So the evidence is, you'll have sources, you'll be citing the evidence, that's the data. The warrant is your analysis, your explanation of why the evidence supports the claim. And then the backing is just some additional logical reasoning to support the warrant. So sometimes a backing is provided with an example where the author will say, for example. That's a common way that backing shows up, not always, but that's a kind of quick and dirty way of me explaining it. But yeah. The author, Veronica, you're familiar with this book. Will you drop a link in to the chat?
Yeah, I was typing in the names and then I'll put the link in.
Mackey and McAvoy, 6 Steps to Success. I will just put this out there. I don't think it's not my favorite book for teaching how to write a lit review, but I think they have a lot of really good figures if you're a visual learner to show how these different components fit together when you're building a complex argument for a lit review. I don't think that there's 6 steps to writing a lit review, kind of flip the authors are.
Yeah, and I do think that the idea of the backing and the warrants and all that can be confusing. So I totally get that. It takes a while to grasp that idea, but they do have a lot of good stuff.
Yeah, they do. They have a lot of good examples in their text and visuals, which I'm a visual learner, so it helps.
Yeah, me too.
Okay, so we have 3 minutes left. I'm just going to give you everyone a little more information about the Academic Writing Center in case you're curious. Today's topic, we talk about topics like this all the time at the Academic Writing Center. We even have a workshop later this month where we're specifically focusing on counter arguments. So the Writing Center is a community of practice. We have weekly writing workshops, writing retreats. We have an academic writing repository where we record workshops like these. And so you can go back and watch them and have access to the resources. And then if you want one-on-one writing support, we do have writing coaches available. Veronica and I are currently implementing office hours, which is new, where you can drop in a small group, maximum of 4 people, and meet with a writing coach and get real-time feedback on your writing. So you kind of think of it as a virtual university writing center. This is what our on-demand library looks like in case you're curious. You can click on these different categories, watch the webinar, and then get access to all the resources. These are the benefits. I'm looking at the time. And then these are some recent upcoming workshops and retreats. So this month we talked about the meal plan structure, scholar wellness, academic arguments, techniques for citing and introducing sources. And then next month, we're going to talk about researcher positionality, how to develop a CV, punctuation, and then we'll have writing retreats and office hours.
Oh, Jessica, someone had asked earlier about do we have presentations really centered on the lit review? And so I thought maybe you might want to address that.
Yeah, so we do. So the lit review is obviously a beast. So it's not, one webinar, but we have several different workshops that we've recorded that I categorize under the lit review. So for example, we've had 2 workshops on synthesis that are in the on-demand library, internal and external organizational structures. I did another one recently. I can't remember. We've done so many that are relevant to the lit review. We don't really have a workshop series that's like how to write a lit review from beginning to end, because that's just a lot. It would take up a lot of our workshops, and not everyone's working on their lit review. So we don't want to kind of isolate people. But if that's something that you're really struggling with, we do have an on-demand course that is very affordable. That is how to write a lit review. It has like 9 hours of instruction with lots of examples and resources. But then in the Writing Center, you can also get that support. It's just not going to be, packaged as an on-demand course. There's going to be just different workshops you can watch and learn about these different aspects of writing a lit review. Hopefully that's helpful. Okay. It's 1:30. Oh, that went by fast. I'll just quickly say we do have a special offer if you want to join the Writing Center. It's $29 for the first month. After that, it's $99 a month. You can cancel or pause at any time. There's no long-term contract, and you can use this promo code. And you can go to our website at theacademicwritingcenter.com. We have one more webinar coming up. Veronica is teaching it on March 1st on techniques for citing and introducing sources, which we're also covering in one of our workshops for the Writing Center this month. So yeah, I hope everyone enjoyed this webinar. As I said earlier, I will send out the recording as soon as it's available with all the resources that I touched on today. Thanks.
Someone had asked Jessica about the